Margaret stood trembling outside Belmont's, the city's most exclusive store, after being humiliated and thrown out like trash. The security guards laughed as she clutched her late husband's watch, the only thing of value she had left. Little did they know in just 6 hours everything would change forever. Before we dive into this incredible story of karma and justice, smash that like button if you believe good people deserve better treatment. And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss stories like this that prove what goes around, comes around. I want you to meet Margaret Chen, a 67-year-old woman who, just 3 months ago, had watched her husband of 40 years take his final breath. David Chen wasn't a famous man or a wealthy one by most standards, but he was Margaret's everything. They had built a simple, beautiful life together, raising 3 children, celebrating small victories, weathering life's storms hand in hand. But cancer doesn't care about love stories or future plans. It took David slowly, painfully, draining not just his life but their savings account too. Medical bills have a way of doing that, don't they? They pile up like snow in winter, silent at first, then suddenly overwhelming everything you thought you had secure. Now Margaret was alone, living on a pension that barely covered her rent, let alone the mounting expenses that seemed to follow her everywhere. She had already sold most of their belongings, the china set from their wedding, David's tools, even her own jewelry. But there was one thing she had held on to, one precious item she couldn't bear to part with until now. The Rolex Submariner sitting in its worn leather box on her kitchen table wasn't just a watch. It was David's 40th anniversary gift to her, something he had saved for months to afford. I can still remember the way his eyes lit up when he placed it on her wrist that evening, how he whispered, "Promise me you'll only sell this if you absolutely have to, Maggie. This represents every good moment we've shared." Well, that moment had come. Margaret's refrigerator was nearly empty, and her landlord had already called twice about late rent. She had heard from a neighbor that Belmont's, the most prestigious luxury store in the city, sometimes purchased high-end items from customers. It was her last hope. That Tuesday morning, Margaret dressed in her best clothes, a navy blue dress she had worn to church for the past 5 years, and the pearl earrings David had given her for their 25th anniversary. She brushed her silver hair carefully and applied just a touch of lipstick. Even in her desperation, Margaret Chen had never lost her dignity. The bus ride to the upscale shopping district felt longer than usual. Margaret sat clutching the watch box in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges nervously. Other passengers barely noticed the elderly woman in the worn dress. But Margaret felt like everyone could see her desperation, her need written across her face like a neon sign. Belmont stood before her like a glass and marble monument to wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across polished floors, so clean you could see your reflection. The air smelled of expensive perfume and leather, and every surface seemed to gleam with an otherworldly shine. Margaret had never felt smaller in her life. The other customers glided through the store like they belonged there. Women in designer handbags worth more than Margaret's monthly income. Men in tailored suits checking gold watches that probably cost more than her car. She could feel their eyes on her as she approached the jewelry counter, their whispered conversations suddenly stopping. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" The voice belonged to Jessica, a young sales associate with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. She looked Margaret up and down like she was evaluating damaged goods. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I believe I am. I have a watch I'd like to have appraised. I was told Belmont's sometimes purchases quality pieces." Jessica's smile faltered completely. She glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Well, we typically work with established clients, people who understand our standards." The way she said people made Margaret feel like an unwelcome intruder in a sacred space. "I understand your standards," Margaret replied quietly, opening the watch box. "This is a Rolex Submariner, purchased new in 1984. It's been well maintained and—" "Ma'am," a new voice interrupted her, sharp and cold. Richard Ashford, the store manager, had appeared beside Jessica like a storm cloud. His expensive suit and slick-back hair screamed authority, and his eyes held the kind of cruelty that comes from years of looking down on people. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret's heart began racing. But I haven't done anything wrong. I just want someone to look at my watch. We don't deal with people like you, Richard said, his voice loud enough that nearby customers turned to stare. This isn't a pawn shop. We have a reputation to maintain, and frankly, your presence here is making our legitimate customers uncomfortable. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Around her, she could hear the whispers starting, customers pulling out their phones, pointing, some even laughing behind manicured hands. She felt like an animal in a zoo, something to be gawked at and mocked. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Margaret said, her voice trembling now. My husband saved for months to buy this watch. It's genuine, it's valuable, and I just need— What you need, Richard interrupted, is to understand that not every establishment is appropriate for every person. Mike, he called to the security guard stationed near the entrance. Please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our customers. Mike, a large man with small eyes and an even smaller heart, strutted over like he was doing the most important job in the world. Come on, lady. Time to go. Please, Margaret whispered, but her plea fell on deaf ears. Mike grabbed her arm, not gently, not with the respect you'd show someone's grandmother, but roughly like she was nothing more than a piece of trash to be disposed of. The walk to the exit felt like a mile. Every step echoed in Margaret's ears as customers stopped their shopping to watch the show. Some looked uncomfortable, but most seemed entertained by the drama unfolding before them. Margaret tried to maintain what was left of her dignity, but when Mike's grip tightened and he pulled her faster, she stumbled. The watch box flew from her hands, hitting the marble floor with a sickening crack. The beautiful leather case that had protected her most precious possession for decades split open, sending the watch skittering across the polished surface. Pick up your junk and get out, Mike sneered, actually kicking the damaged box toward her. Some people just don't know their place. Margaret knelt on that cold marble floor, her 67-year-old knees protesting against the hard surface, and gathered the pieces of her broken hope. The watch was unharmed, thank God, but the case, David's case, was ruined. Around her, she could hear the clicks of camera phones, the barely contained laughter, the cruel comments. Did you see that old woman? Someone whispered. Honestly, security should have stopped her at the door, came another voice. Some people have no shame. Margaret's hands shook as she closed the damaged box and stood up. She looked back once at the sea of judgmental faces, at Jessica, who was now helping a proper customer, at Richard, who was straightening his tie with satisfaction, at Mike, who was already walking away like nothing had happened. She walked out of Belmont's that day feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her entire life. Sitting on a bench in the small park across from the store, Margaret finally allowed herself to cry. Not the dignified tears of grief she had shed for David, but the desperate sobs of someone who had reached the end of their rope. She clutched the broken watch box to her chest and whispered to the man she missed more than breathing. David, I'm so sorry. I couldn't even sell your watch. I failed us both. The afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the park, and Margaret had never felt more alone. She had no plan B, no other options. This had been her last hope, and it had been crushed under the heel of human cruelty. She might have sat there all night if her phone hadn't rung. Is this Mrs. Margaret Chen? The voice was professional but kind, nothing like the voices she had heard in the store. Yes, this is Margaret. Mrs. Chen, my name is James Morrison. I'm an attorney with Morrison, Davidson and Associates. I've been trying to reach you for several months regarding your late husband's estate. Margaret's heart sank. Another bill, another debt she couldn't pay. I'm sorry, but if this is about money we owe, I don't have— No, ma'am, James interrupted gently. This is about money owed to you. The world seemed to stop spinning. Margaret was sure she had misheard. I'm sorry, what? Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about your husband's business history. Did David ever mention a partnership with someone named William Belmont? Margaret's mind raced. Belmont? Like the store. She looked across the street at the gleaming storefront that had just humiliated her. Yes, exactly like the store. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to meet. 1 hour later, Margaret sat in James Morrison's office, still clutching her damaged watch box, as the lawyer spread out documents that would change everything. In 1983, your husband David and William Belmont started a small import business together, James explained, his finger tracing lines on a yellowed contract. They were young men with big dreams and very little money. David invested his life savings, about $5,000, while William contributed a similar amount. Margaret nodded slowly. David mentioned something about a business venture when we were first married, but it didn't work out. He said he decided to focus on family instead. That's partially correct. David did leave the partnership in 1984 to focus on raising your family. William bought out David's shares for $10,000, which seemed fair at the time since the business was struggling. Margaret waited, sensing there was more. James leaned forward. However, there was a clause in their original partnership agreement that both men forgot about over the years. It stated that if the business ever exceeded $100 million in value, the original partners would be entitled to retroactive profit sharing based on their initial investment percentages. The room felt like it was spinning. What are you saying? Mrs. Chen, William Belmont's company, including the store chain, the real estate holdings, and all subsidiary businesses, is now worth approximately $1.6 billion. According to the contract your husband signed, you are entitled to 30% of everything. Margaret's hands went numb. The watch box slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the carpet this time. That's over $480 million, Mrs. Chen. You're one of the wealthiest women in the state. The next morning, Margaret walked through the doors of Belmont's again. This time she wasn't alone. James Morrison walked beside her, along with two other attorneys and a notary public. Margaret wore the same navy dress, the same pearl earrings, carried the same cracked watch box. Nothing about her appearance had changed, but everything else was different. Jessica was helping another customer when she looked up and saw Margaret. Her face went white as if she'd seen a ghost. "Ma'am," Jessica stammered, abandoning her customer. "I thought we made it clear yesterday that—" "Where is Mr. Ashford?" James Morrison's voice cut through the store like a blade. Richard appeared almost instantly, his face darkening when he recognized Margaret. "I thought I told you people—" "My name is James Morrison," the attorney interrupted, handing Richard a thick folder. "I represent Mrs. Margaret Chen, the majority owner of this establishment." You could have heard a pin drop. Richard's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then a sickening shade of green as he opened the folder and saw the legal documents inside. "This is impossible," Richard whispered. "I assure you it's quite possible," James replied calmly. "Mrs. Chen owns 51% of all Belmont enterprises, including this store. She's here to observe how her business operates." Margaret watched as Richard's entire demeanor crumbled. The arrogant man who had called her "people like you" was now stuttering apologies, begging for forgiveness, promising that there had been some terrible mistake. "There was a mistake," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent store. "The mistake was thinking that a person's worth can be measured by their bank account or the clothes they wear." She turned to James. "I'd like to review the security footage from yesterday, please." What followed was perhaps the most uncomfortable hour in Belmont's history. Margaret, her lawyers, and the senior staff watched the footage of her humiliation on repeat. They saw Richard's cruel dismissal, Jessica's obvious disgust, Mike's rough treatment, and the way Margaret had been forced to crawl on the floor to collect her broken belongings, while customers laughed and filmed. "Is this how Belmont's represents luxury and class?" Margaret asked when the footage ended. Richard had no answer. Jessica was crying. Mike wasn't even there. He'd called in sick, probably sensing that his world was about to change. "Effective immediately," Margaret announced, "Richard Ashford is terminated for violating basic human decency and company values. Jessica Morrison will be demoted and enrolled in mandatory sensitivity training, and Mike Peterson will be terminated for excessive force against a customer." But Margaret wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, "this store will be renamed Chen Belmont's to honor both the original partnership and ensure that my husband's memory is part of this company's legacy. We will be implementing new policies immediately. Every customer, regardless of their appearance or perceived wealth, will be treated with dignity and respect." Margaret opened her cracked watch box and carefully lifted out David's Rolex. This watch represents 40 years of love, sacrifice, and partnership. Yesterday, your staff decided it, and I, weren't good enough for this store. Today, I'm making sure that never happens to anyone else. She walked to the jewelry counter and placed the watch on the velvet display surface. This will be the first item in our new Treasured Memories collection. Pieces with stories, pieces that matter to people, regardless of their market value, because the true worth of something isn't measured in dollars. Over the following weeks, Margaret transformed not just Belmont's, but the entire shopping experience. She established a fund to help elderly customers who needed to sell precious belongings, created a training program for staff on treating all customers with respect, and turned part of the store into a memorial space for David, complete with the story of their partnership and William Belmont's rise to success. The most beautiful part? Margaret chose kindness where she could have chosen revenge. She could have destroyed the people who humiliated her, but instead she used her power to ensure no one else would suffer the same fate. 6 months later, Chen Belmont's had become the most talked about luxury store in the country, not just for its merchandise, but for its revolutionary approach to customer service. Margaret had proven that true luxury isn't about exclusivity. It's about making every person feel valued and respected. Richard Ashford now works at a small electronics store across town, hopefully having learned that treating people with cruelty has consequences. Jessica completed her training and became one of the store's most compassionate employees, often sharing Margaret's story with customers and other staff members. Mike found work elsewhere, though rumors say he's much more careful about how he treats people now. As for Margaret, she never moved out of her small apartment. She kept her simple life, her church attendance, her quiet dignity. The only difference was that now she could help others, paying medical bills for families in need, supporting local charities, and ensuring that David's memory lived on through acts of kindness. The cracked watch box sits in a place of honor in her living room, a reminder that sometimes our greatest treasures come disguised as our most painful moments. Margaret's story isn't just about karma, it's about the power of treating every human being with dignity, regardless of what they can offer you in return. It's about remembering that everyone has a story, everyone has struggles, and everyone deserves basic respect. If this story of justice restored your faith in karma, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that respect should never depend on your bank account. Subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove good people always find their way. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Let me know in the comments below. Remember, we never know who might walk through our doors, what struggles they're facing, or what power they might hold. The next time you see someone who looks like they might not belong, remember Margaret Chen and choose kindness instead of judgment. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to make our way in this world, and a little kindness costs nothing but can change everything.